So, today we're going to be discussing mental health in cults, as well as online cults that have developed that we can observe now. We can observe many of the patterns, right? And I invite you to consider today from an objective space, right? I invite you to consider why is it that we will sit without making ourselves bad or wrong, by the way? Why would we? Why do we sit for hours on end to observe these platforms, this platform or other platforms, discussing cults, right? And by the way, I don't have the only perspective. You're always welcome to comment respectfully. Why do we sit for hours? I think it can be observed that many of us are looking to familiarize ourselves with these cults and also looking to bond. Um, you can hear and observe in the comment sections people sharing, oh, I've had a similar experience, or I know someone that's had an experience. I think definitely looking for safety, perhaps in numbers, to come together to acknowledge what we observe, a pattern that is showing up in our community and communities with these cults. So we have these cults and the fact that many folks, likely, especially young folks, though not limited to young adults, many folks likely, because we are so enamored with gift of gab and rhetoric and good stories, and people that make us feel good with their talent with words, it's likely that initially we're not considering the mental health of these cult leaders. Not only cult leaders, but of some of the platforms that were initially the personalities on some platforms that were initially supposed to be helpful. Some of them have said that their mission was to help people out of cults, especially young people. And there have actually been quite a few that platforms that were around for a while and then they disappeared. So I invite you, I think perhaps the shortcut is to observe the patterns, to get educated, as much objective information as you can, to get educated. And I think there's a distinction. Distinctions can be so very important, right? Because we can assume that we all mean the same thing. Yet, one of the patterns that can be observed is a lot of the semantics and rhetoric. Sometimes the stuckness on information, whether it's astrology or ancient history, in the absence of prioritizing, looking at, and observing the actual patterns of behavior that are before us in real time. It seems that we can be so enamored and romanticizing the language. And it makes sense because it's understandable because there's a need, an emotional need to identify with something that's grounding and familiar and something that is self affirming. So it makes sense, for folks that have experienced some trauma, personal trauma on the world scene. It makes sense that there's a looking for meaning and a validation, yet this very thing is often what is exploited. So most people are not, especially young people, are not considering because we're so impressed by words and gift of gab. We're not considering that many of these cult leaders have mental health issues. They also have financial issues. They have issues with responsibility, with taking care of their own children and their own responsibilities. They have their own stuff. uh, and there's a conflict of interest often in some of the patterns and life advice that they're giving. Right? For example, you could have some people that you trust because they seem like a father figure or an elder figure, or you maybe like their shells or their beads, you like their hairstyle or the tone of their voice. And you may not be considering that you don't know this person's violent tendencies. You don't know if they don't take care of a lot of their children. You don't know if they practice unsafe, intimate relations. You don't know if they're an old person that is manipulating young boys or young men or women intimately into intimate relations. So there's a lot of mental health. You don't know if they have had a mental health crisis. You don't know if they've had a diagnosis. You just can't see who people are. So a question to consider is the mental health. These little small trans boxes, screens, trigger boxes, TV are so extremely limited. And so the people that are in front of the screens, whether they're actors, actresses, celebrity entertainers, as well as cult leaders, they are more hyper. They're extremely aware of the ability to use language and pictures and to insinuate in order to manipulate the desires for what people want to see, and knowing that people want to experience a distraction from things that are uncomfortable in our own lives and perhaps our own trauma that we've experienced in life. So, mental health, you're not considering sometimes these folks might be off, crazy, violent, volatile, verbally abusive. These are things that are often not considered because someone, when initially meeting you and they have their own agenda, folks are going to be on their best behavior, especially until you have endured the slow drip of the hazing process, right? The indoctrination into the cult. So the reason that perhaps we're sitting for hours is to identify with the patterns of these cults. Though many platforms that were started out as helpful, or come bearing words, and it's interesting, a lot of the patterns are similar to the actual cults. A lot of the platforms that were initially gung ho and supposed to be being so helpful and actually did put information, were instrumental in spreading information and awareness of cult activities. Yet it can be seen now objectively that the tone of voice, the way that personalities are communicating and speaking to their audience, um, is actually very verbally abusive. And what's even just as interesting is not only do we have the cult leaders, and then we have the personalities that were supposedly supposed to be helpful, but then also within the audience. And this is something for us to consider in our quiet moments. Are allowing, it has become normalized to allow ourselves to be handled in a verbally abusive way. It has been normalized. That is really something to consider. Where does that dynamic, where does that sprout from? How has it become so normalized? And what potentially are the long term effects? Do we, similar to the people that have been on the receiving end of the cult, go from cult to cult, or go from online platform to online platform looking for quote unquote leadership, somebody to make us feel a certain way, yet who is still verbally abusive, and yet who we also actually do not know in real life? These are very distinct cult patterns, right? And I don't think many of us would have imagined, right, that platforms commenting on or giving guidance and support to people coming out of cults or striving to educate people on cults. I don't think many of us really considered in the beginning that these could potentially become cults. I don't think it was on our radar. So, in a sense, it's been a lot of education on and insight on the patterns of human behavior. I really hope that people are coming away that that's a good take home, right? Is understanding the patterns of human behavior. It's not exclusive, definitely, to the chocolate community, yet this particular sector is something that culturally, I think we have been in denial of, and now it's come to the surface for us to recognize, so we can see where to make some shifts in our behavior. So, if we're sitting for hours, perhaps that's familiarize ourselves with the patterns of cults, and then also to bond around some sense of community, some sense of justice. Yet, is there a conflict of interest if we're handing over responsibility and giving a title to an online personality who we don't know, giving titles and ascribing virtual responsibility or positions of authority to the unqualified? to folks that perhaps demonstrate a lack of emotional stability, a lack of being of maturity, definitely a lack of personal boundaries, right? Because it's usually people, many of humans that have been violated, that have from an early age have an issue with respect and personal boundaries. When somebody says no, or just crossing lines of familiarity, especially with strangers on the internet, and also from an anonymous standpoint. It's actually quite dangerous, though it is something for us to just take a look at, right, to understand why. So there's a conflict of interest. You can't truly know what the motivation or the agenda is of these people, these unqualified people who demonstrate verbally abusive tendencies eventually, who demonstrate a lack of maturity emotionally, who demonstrate and have a track record of a lack of character, and we're ascribing a lot to these people. So I think it's something for not for us just to consider the cult leaders and the cults and the online personalities, though there's a dynamic going on here. What role do the onlookers play? As we watch folks go from one cult to another in search of something, it can also be observed that the audience of onlookers goes from platform to platform in search of something, and it appears that it's more than information. It's more than just the information that we're looking for, because if you're really passionate, you can find the information. But yet, there's something in us bonding, and in particular distinction, we're bonding and giving information, access to our psyche and to our emotions and even our pocketbook to the unqualified and the unvetted, just based on gift of gab and words and somebody having a convincing enough story. It's actually amazing, and it's actually dangerous. Some other things for us to consider, in addition to the conflict of interest that there may be with the cult leader and also the online personalities that initially were supposed to help, is if we can see and note the pattern of polarization, where the audience and the onlookers, again, because we like a certain personality, we get so polarized that it becomes mob-like and gang-like when somebody has a different experience or a different perspective other than what is held on their platform. And then there's also the absence of a respect, the absence of a mature, or at least striving uh, to cultivate, even if it's something we haven't been raised with, to cultivate maturity in our communication with each other. What did this I think is very revealing, just like it's been very revealing to see the prevalence of cults, maybe for something, perhaps something that's been taboo that we haven't wanted to address. Well, it's come to the surface for us to take a look at very squarely. So the absence of a maturity level, we can observe that perhaps we are traumatizing or re-traumatizing ourselves and triggering back and forth, re-triggering and re-traumatizing people in the audience. Again, there's a reason why we would invest the non-renewable resource of our time to watch these channels. So how much of it at some point is, can we say it's for education, right? What kinds of bonds are we looking to have, and bonds with who? To these characters who we do not know online. Can we honestly say that we observe healthy, respectful behaviors, the development and the nurturing of effective, efficient communication skills when it comes to resolving problems with strangers online with no boundaries? I think we can definitely observe, let's say, for example, Bigo, which now you can see samples of Bigo or clips from it on YouTube. Can we honestly say that it is for our cultivation or for our maturity? Can we actually say that we're developing new skill sets when we partake in this way? And there's something that we are drawn to. I'm about to consider something that we are drawn to, right? Can we say that we're getting healthy behaviors? What can we say to the mature adults, not just the persons that have been inside the cults, but the parenting or the counseling skills, the ability and the maturity to hold space for people as they are expressing? It definitely says something that we use. And again, I'm not here to make it bad or wrong, just something for us to observe that we're using the technology to interact and have roundtables or discussions or forums that don't seem to, they seem to land in uh, sarcasm, ridicule, um, self righteousness. Uh, I don't know that we leave any more enriched or any more clear. Now, again, I will say that numerous platforms have been definitely helpful and instrumental in sharing information about cults and cult patterns and personalities. Some people didn't even know who they were. People are out busy working and about the business of life. So many of these things are numerous adults that have never heard anything about this. That's one of the ways that many young people are lured into cults. And being that there was no documentation initially, when the few folks that did do a little research on cults, they couldn't find enough quote unquote negative information or enough of a cross reference with these from peers of these cult personalities of their character. There wasn't enough, even when people made the effort. Again, I've shared that I visited the place that I experienced as a cult. I read their books. I visited, took a trip over there. Before I did ask questions, and I sought to ask questions to people who may have known this person. So that was a good first start. But looking back, it wasn't, knowing what I know now, it wasn't enough of a cross reference. It didn't tell me enough. Visiting somewhere is totally different than living somewhere, right? There are a lot of nuances and things that you're not going to see. And even when I initially made trips where I stayed at this particular cult in another country, I was so enamored by, perhaps it was the perceived lifestyle and the freedom or the difference in lifestyle in a tropical environment in a garden community that a lot of things didn't come up on my radar. Now, many things did come up on my radar, but I wasn't there long enough to see other patterns. So passing through somewhere and talking to someone online is by no means the same as living with someone day in and day out. And usually, when you are dealing with a cult, there's a drip of a hazing process. And when you come initially, you're going to be isolated. So looking back now, I was very isolated, and there were reasons and justifications that were given for the isolation and the quarantine of people, but it's not a whole picture, right? Let's say, for example, the cult is quarantining you so you don't contaminate their young people with your habits coming from the outside world. Though, also, what is happening is you're not being allowed to see the inconsistencies and the dysfunctional behavior, and also the very human flaws that exist within the cult. It's very, very controlled. So that's a really important distinction. It's a lot that you will not get privy to until it is demonstrated that you have proven a loyalty to the cult. Ask me how I know. And I'm aware, because I was around so long, I'm aware of people that have attempted, numerous people that have attempted to leave the cult and then return. Or similar to what we've seen online, they were gaslit into staying. Keep in mind, there's some people that once they have children, that's a very real bond into the cult, and they've also formed bonds with other cult members, and also at some point are isolated from the initial families. So the maturity level, we can observe objectively that a lot of that is missing. Um, I think it's we're not realizing or may not really be considering that a lot of the online personalities that we may be being triggered and are re-triggering and perhaps re-traumatizing each other. And definitely, I don't know that the onlookers, the audience considers that they're constantly and we are constantly being gaslit on all sides by the cult leader, um, the online personalities, and the audience gaslighting each other. So, folks have become very polarized in their different camps with the personalities that you like. Many of these, the initial personalities that were monitoring cults, at some point went in another direction. And every now and then there'll be a sprinkling of a person that would point out some things that seem a little off. And then people in the comment section, because we have our quote unquote allegiance to our favorites, would go after and attack or be verbally volatile through their keyboards to people that expressed that something was off in this person who we liked and appreciated them spreading awareness on this important topic. But then it seemed that most of the platforms very early on went into another direction. A few other distinctions that perhaps may be helpful is trust. So trust is being ascribed not only to these cult leaders that appear to be saviors, messiahs, ascribe themselves the titles of priests and so on, that trust and access to our psyches, our personal information, personalized trauma, our finances, and our reproductive organs. Trust is given much too quickly to the unvetted simply because we like the presentation, we like the oratory skills, we were enamored by the stories they told of back in the days. It's a bonding, and it's actually, hopefully, now it can be seen that is actually a manipulation, and that is it's a distinct pattern uh, of, it's a distinct communication pattern, this pattern of manipulation, of sharing, of bonding, of gaslighting, of love bombing, and then pulling back, and then of verbal abuse, then of shaming and public shaming. These are distinct cult like patterns. So trust is being ascribed way too early and unvetted. So as a young person, I know what a vetting process is. A vetting process is a process of qualifying, like an interview, a thorough interview. Like today, companies may interview 3, 4 times, and before trust is ascribed to you, there has to be a demonstration. There's an actual earning of trust, uh, and the emotions and your liking of a person is put to the side for a thorough proving and demonstration of the person is who they say they are, a vetting of their character, of their track record, of a transparency of who this person is. There's a total lack of a vetting process for people that we are ascribing trust to and access to our psyche, right? Our emotions, and often our pocketbooks, right? There's also the betrayal of trust, and then constant betrayal of trust and gaslighting. Again, not only to the persons interacting in these cults, but also to the audience. Also to the audience. Another principle, something for us to consider, is safety. These definitely the cult leaders, but also these platforms. How are folks, or how are you in your private moments? How are you determining that these personalities are safe? Safe, emotionally safe, mentally safe. You can't see these people. You don't see them in their homes, the state of their homes. You can't see how they interact with children, with animals, with their co-workers. You can't see their vices. You can't see how they react when you give a no or a disagreement, right? So there's not enough of a vetting process for who we are describing or ascribing trust to. And again, this speaks to the trauma, some of the same trauma that we see exhibited in young people or people coming out of cults. It can now be seen, the same patterns within the audience, right? The gaslighting of the audience, and the the tendency of the audience to, and I've experienced this myself, where you're thinking, oh wow, this person is level-headed, this person is fair, this person has personality, this person is so funny, this person is so informative, but still you do not know people, because at some point when the verbal abuse and the sarcasm, the gaslighting, um, the denigration, the putting down of the people, of the grown adults being spoken to. Even more amazing, the fact that onlookers allow, it has become normalized for us to allow folks to be verbally abusive to us. And it is justified because that we've ascribed, or they've ascribed themselves a term of priest or whatever title they've given themselves, of knowledge bearer or whatever. There's somehow a desire for some kind of leadership, a desire to submit to something. Even when we think, some people that they're coming away from traditional religion, there's still a distinct pattern, this desire to ascribe power and dominion over ourselves, and the thinking and decision making to something and someone else outside of ourselves. It's an interesting dynamic. This is just something for us to consider. How are we perceiving people as safe spaces? This seems to speak to the this seems to speak and to say that there's a desire for safety, but it's being ascribed to people who haven't been vetted. And in actuality, when it has been shared that these individuals are not safe based on their track record and their habit, which is very significant, it seems that we turn a blind eye in the cult sector, when it comes to religious personalities or leaders, when it comes to politicians. There are some distinct patterns of us turning a blind eye to actual patterns, consistent patterns of behavior in lieu of gift of gab and presentation. And today we're looking at little teeny handheld screens that with scripted behavior from a certain angle, and we're ascribing trust and giving our hard-earned currency, the currency of our attention, as well as fiat and paper money, to personalities where we are ascribing, and I get it, we are romanticizing these personalities and who we would like them to be. What does that say? What's the disconnect? Is there something perhaps missing where there's this tendency and this pattern to ascribe leadership positions to the unvetted, to the unqualified, to people who may likely be just as emotionally unstable as the cult personalities that are being spoken about? And there's a spectrum. There's definitely a spectrum. So some take-home things again for us to consider when it comes to prevention, right? Being preemptive, being able to avoid these cults. Well, that would seem to say that we want to have a thorough, or strive to have a thorough understanding. What's missing here? What's the pattern? What's at the basis of why would we ascribe trust to the unvetted, or folks that have demonstrated they have a general lack of character, that are sarcastic, that are verbally abusive? Why are we ascribing positions of trust and authority to just any and everybody, to the unvetted and to the unqualified? And how can we prevent this, especially when it comes to young people? Because it's apparent, without making us bad or wrong, it's apparent that a lot of these behaviors are rooted in trauma. And let me say that inside the community section today, there are several videos that can be very helpful resources about understanding PTSD and complex PTSD. I think they can be really, really insightful. Please take advantage of them. Right? So it's easy to get into astrology, which is not grounded necessarily in character and behavior. We have a tendency to be drawn to rhetoric, information, and things that are making us feel good, but they're not grounded in consistent patterns of behavior. So prevention, understanding patterns, can really be shifted when it comes to education. So this is where those videos, perhaps, that are not talking about astrology and so-called spirituality, which is very subjective and can be interpreted, and the with semantics, the context can be switched at will, right? So education and the insight of personal experience. Uh, it's not information. Objective information can be very, very helpful as well as insight. So anytime you're able to vet personalities by their peers and by their track record, that would go a long way in us developing some discernment. Looking for maturity, right? Now, granted, people can have a good gift of gab and you can't see them on these limited screens, how they interact with children, how they interact when you tell them no, or when you have a disagreement. I do think maturity doesn't mean that we can't have any emotions, but maturity and watching the intention um, of folks is really, really important to dial into how these people are making you feel. And also, again, what can be noted is that there seems to have been normalized sarcasm, insults, and the allowing of verbal abuse from people in so called positions of leadership, which is, I would say it's wild, but then again, it's not because this pattern can be seen in numerous areas. Again, political, with political leaders, religious leaders, we are just allowing any old kind of behavior and mistreatment. We're allowing it. The audience is allowing it. Uh, the cult leaders are definitely dishing it out. And then also, there are some platforms that were supposed to be helpful, started out as helpful, that has become something else. And so, rather than make us bad or wrong, do we have a vested interest in having a different result? Are any of these platforms really encouraging us? Are we encouraging ourselves really to be self reflective, right? Not just mentally looping, but self reflective. Legal, financial, and sometimes physical consequences, but definitely legal and financial consequences is very, very objective. Are we noting, right, that these people that we have ascribed leadership to, whether they are cult leaders, online personalities, or to each other, right? Are there boundaries in us dealing with each other? Because people, predators as well as people, understand consequences. So it appears that don't appear to be consequences dished out. So it's one of the reasons why it can be observed. There's a general lack of boundaries and respect because people deem there will be no legal or financial consequences, right? Because the respect shows up not as words, it shows up as actions. And consequences, always legal and financial. If you really think about it, this is one of the reasons why folks don't know the legal names. You don't even know the legal names of the cult leaders, the online personalities, or the people that we're dealing with, or the audience. Everyone has a cartoon picture avatar. So it's very anonymous, right? It's like a whole fantasy world. It's very, very anonymous, and it's something that is happening. Um, Again, not just with the cult personality or with the online personalities, but also with the audience, right? And there's gaslighting aplenty. So it would benefit us to understand the patterns of gaslighting, because again, it's not just the cult leaders, it's not just the online personalities. It can be observed that the audiences were gaslighting and re-triggering, sometimes re-traumatizing each other. So where does this end up? What's the trajectory? What's the trajectory in the sea of trauma, triggering, re-triggering? Again, I'm not saying that it's not helpful, because it has been helpful to for folks to spread information about this very taboo subject of um, cult manipulation and the manipulation of people's trauma by folks understanding how to work gift of gab and new information, and folks that are manipulating people who may be autistic, who may be traumatized, who may be going through a life crisis in their lives. So these are just some things to consider. Mental health is a priority. Again, there's some resources in the community section on CPTSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, post-stress disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder. And I think they'll be very, very enlightening, this objective information. So perhaps we can press pause, because it can suck any of us right in, because it's a lot of this information and interacting is bypassing the conscious mind and is constantly hitting the subconscious in terms of being triggered, re-triggered, triggering each other. You can see it in the lack of maturity and the lack of boundaries and respect in our dealings with each other. So Hopefully, folks have found this helpful. This is in the with the intention of folks being preemptive and being able to prevent going into a cult, right? So you can resolve your own issues. I resolve the minutes we're on our own, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? But seeking, I don't even know if we can call it support, but seeking guidance from the unvetted, from anyone ascribing these titles to themselves, um, can be very damaging and dangerous, and is also something to consider is, for us to sit for hours and hours after we have a lot of information and education, for us to sit for so many hours, what are we looking to bond over? And where are we looking to end up? What's going to be the take home? Where is this going to end up at? Right? So I invite you all to keep your thinking caps on, to cultivate discernment and common sense and trusting of your own gut over allowing ourselves to be gaslit, love bombed, and to allow verbal abuse. Because you can feel when something is off. There's a difference between a critique and a criticism and a bashing. But at a basic level, I think we can all figure out when someone is communicating with us in a way that is very disrespectful. So I invite you all to create a great rest of the day on purpose. You're welcome to share your feedback respectfully.